Please help me. I'm stuck in my room months after surviving the most traumatic experience of my life, and according to my doctor, I'm developing agoraphobia. But I don't think he or my family understand that I'm in literal fucking danger. I haven't slept in, 3 days? I can't eat, and I've locked myself in here for my own safety, as well as my father's and brother's. I have no clue what to tell them. Fuck, I don't even know where to start. I try to explain, but the words get tangled in my throat, like I'm choking on a tongue twister. And I won't tell you why my hands are slick with blood, sticky, wet, and fucking vile. I can still feel it, like there's something lodged deep inside me. So deep, not even my dad's penknife can reach it. I've spent most of the week hunched over the bathroom sink, watching dried blood swirl down the drain like tea leaves. I've carved into my ear so many times the sting of the blade doesn't even register anymore. But you have to understand, if I don't get this thing out of me, they'll find me again. And this time, I'm not sure I'll survive. First, let me make this clear. This isn't some attention-seeking bullshit. I know what I went through seriously fucked with my head, but like I keep telling everyone, I know they're not done with us. My doctor thinks I'm crazy, and my dad is considering sending me to a psych ward. Mom is different. She's been on the other side of my bedroom door all day, guarding me, protecting me from them. Dad says it's PTSD, and maybe that's part of it, but I'm also being hunted. Maybe a psych ward is what's best for me, but they'll find me, just like they've undoubtedly found the other 4. I've never felt so helpless, so hopeless, so alone. Dad is convinced just because Grammy had schizophrenia, I must have it too. Mom told him to leave. Like I said, for his own safety. This is me screaming into the void because I have nobody else to talk to. I'm 17 years old, and back in July, my mom forced me to join a social experiment which was basically, non-televised, Big Brother, but for Gen Z. I wasn't interested. Last year's summer camp had already been a disaster. A kid caught some virus. He didn't die, but he got really sick, and they said it had something to do with the lake. Luckily, I didn't swim in it. Camp was cancelled, and for months afterward, I had to go in for bi-weekly checks to make sure I wasn't infected. I thought this summer would be less of a mess. But then Mom gave me an ultimatum. Either I join a summer camp or extracurricular like my brother, or she'd send me to live with Dad. For reasons I won't explain, yes, I'd rather risk contracting a disease than spend the summer with Dad. His idea of a vacation is dragging my brother and me to his office. Now that Travis and I are old enough to make our own decisions, we avoid him like the plague. The divorce just made it easier. Mum never stops. She either works, runs errands, or creates new jobs so she can stay busy. When we were younger, she was diagnosed with depression. A lot of my childhood was spent sitting on her bed, begging her to get up, or being stuck in Dad's office, playing games on his laptop. Now, Mum makes up for all that lost time by being insufferable. She thought she was helping, but in reality, I was being smothered. When I wasn't interested in participating in her summer plans, my mother already had a rebuttal. Looming over me, blonde wisps of hair falling in overshadowed eyes, and wrapped up like a marshmallow, Mum resembled my personal angel of death. "Just read it," she sighed, refilling my juice. The flyer looked semi-professional. If you ignored the Comic Sans, it was black and white, with a simple triangle in the center. I'll admit I was kind of intrigued. 10 teenagers, 5 boys and 5 girls, all living together in a mansion on the edge of town. It sounded like a recipe for disaster. 2 days later we got the call. I was in. The terms raised brows. I wasn't allowed to use my real name. Instead, I had to pick from a list of traditionally feminine names. Whatever that meant. Marie. Amelia. Rosa. Mom doesn't understand the meaning of no, so I found myself stuck in the passenger seat of her fancy car as she drove me to the preliminary testing center. The tests were supposed to assess our mental and physical health to make sure we were fit for the experiment. The building loomed ahead, a cold, sterile structure of mirrored glass. No welcome signs, no color, just a desolate parking lot and checkerboard windows reflecting the afternoon sun. Yeps, exactly how I wanted to spend my summer, being probed inside a dystopian hellhole. Seeing the testing center was the moment my feeble reluctance, but going along with it anyway, because why not, turned into full-blown panic once I caught sight of those soulless, symmetrical windows staring down at me. With my gut twisting and turning, I begged Mom to let me go to the disease-ridden summer camp instead, or better yet, let me stay inside. There was nothing wrong with rotting in bed all day. "I'm not going," I said, refusing to shift from my seat. Mum sighed impatiently, glancing at her phone. My consultation was at 1:30 and it was 1:29. Tessa, Mum said with a sigh, I'm not supposed to tell you this. It's against the rules, but... She rolled her eyes. Call it quid pro quo if you want. I knew what was coming. The same threat every summer. If you don't do what I say, you can go live with your father. I avoided making eye contact with her. I'm not living with Dad. Mum cleared her throat. This isn't just a social experiment, Tessa. It's a test of endurance. The team that stays in the house the longest wins a prize. She paused, playing with her fingers in her lap. $1 million. I nearly fell out of my seat. $1 million, I choked out. Are you serious? Parents aren't supposed to tell the participants. Mum shushed me like they could hear us. It's to avoid coercion. The experiment is supposed to be natural participation and a genuine intention to take part. Mum's lip twitched. But I know you wouldn't participate unless there was money involved. Mum sighed. Is this the wrong time to say you remind me of your father? She was sneaking panicked looks at me, but I was already thinking about how $1 million would get me through college without a dime from Dad, who was using my college fund to drag me on vacations. I snapped out of it when Mum not so gently nudged me with a chuckle. Between the 5 of you, she reminded me. But still, it's a lot of money, Amelia. Amelia. So she was already calling me by my subject name. Totally normal. Before I knew it, I was sitting in a clinically white room with several other kids. No windows, just a single sliding glass door. There were 3 rows of plastic chairs, with 4 occupied, 2 girls on my left, 2 boys on my right, all bathed in painfully bright lights. I could only see their torsos. A guard collected my phone, a towering woman resembling Miss Trunchbull, right down to the too tight knotted hair and military uniform. I barely made it 3 strides before she was stuffing a white box under my nose, 4 iPhones already inside. I dropped my phone in, only for her to pull it back and thrust it back in my face. Turn it off, she spat. I obeyed, my hands growing clammy. I was referred to as Amelia and told to sit in my assigned seat. I could barely see the other participants, that painful light bleeding around their faces, obstructing their identities. It took me a while to realize it was intentional. These people really did not want us to see or speak to each other. I did manage, through a lot of painful squinting, to make out one boy had shaggy, sandy hair, while the other, a redhead, wore Ray-Bans. The girls were a ponytail brunette and a wispy blonde. Time passed, and the guards blocking the doorway made me uneasy. The blonde girl kept shifting in her seat, asking to use the bathroom. I just saw her as a confusing golden blur. When they told her no, she kept standing up and making her way over to the door before being escorted back. The red-headed boy was counting ceiling tiles. Through that intense light bathing him, I could see his head was tipped back. I could hear him muttering numbers to himself and immediately losing his place. When he reached 4,987, he groaned, slumping in his seat. When my gaze lingered on the blonde for too long, the guard snapped at me. Amelia, that's your first warning. The kids around me chuckled, which pissed her off even more. If you break the rules again, you'll be asked to leave. Her voice dropped into a growl when the boys' chuckles turned into full-blown giggles. I tried to hold in my own laughter, but something about being trapped with no phones or parents and forced into a room with literally nothing to entertain us turned us all into kindergartners again, which was refreshing. I think at some point I turned to smile at the blonde, only to be fucking blinded by that almost angelic light. I noticed the guard's knuckles whitened around her iPad. Her patience was thinning with every spluttered giggle. And honestly, that only made it harder not to laugh. Heads down, she ordered. The spluttered laughing was starting to get to her. I don't know what it was about her authoritative tone, but we obeyed almost instantly, ducking our heads like falling dominoes. In 3 strides she loomed over us, the stink of hair gel and shoe polish creeping into my nose and throat. I didn't dare look up, but when one of the boys coughed, I knew I wasn't the only one overwhelmed by the smell. This woman's simple knotted ponytail was not worth that much hair gel. She paced up and down our little line, and I watched her boots thud, thud, thud across the floor. When she stopped in front of me, the smell grew toxic, my eyes smarting, and my eyes started to water. If you make any more noise, you will be asked to leave. With $1 million hanging over my head, I didn't. Luckily, after hanging my head for what felt like 2 hours, my name was finally called. The afternoon was a literal blur. I was welcomed into a small room and told to perch on a bed with a plastic coating, the kind they have in emergency rooms. I went through my usual checkup. They measured my height and weight and drew some blood. According to the man prodding and poking me, my physical health was perfect. During the mental health tests, I answered a series of questions about my well-being, confidence, social life, relationships, and overall attitude toward life. I studied the guy's expression as he ran through the questions, and I swear he didn't even blink. He looked about my dad's age, maybe a little younger, with a receding hairline. He wore casual jeans and a shirt under a white coat. "All right, Amelia, your preliminary tests are looking promising so far," he said, standing and offering me a kind, if slightly suspicious smile. It looked almost mocking. "You're probably not going to like this part, but I can assure you this is simply to protect subject confidentiality." He nodded reassuringly. I tried to smile back, but I was definitely grimacing. He turned his back and rummaged through a drawer, pulling out a scary-looking shot. I hated needles. My gaze was already glued to the door, calculating how to dive off the bed without looking childish. I jumped when a screech echoed from outside, reverberating down the hallway. It was one of the guys. Before I could move, the doctor was in front of me, his warm breath in my face. "Open wide, Amelia." I did, opening my mouth as wide as I could. He chuckled. "Your eyes, Amelia. Open your eyes as wide as you can and try not to blink, all right?" Another cry echoed, louder this time, the same boy. Thundering footsteps pounded down the hallway. "No, let me go. Get the fuck off me. I don't want to..." I found my voice, though it came out as a whimper. "Is he..." "We're having slight trouble with one particular subject," the doctor murmured, his gloved fingers forcing my left eye open. "He is afraid of needles, so..." His tone was gentle, and the knot in my stomach loosened. I barely felt the shot as I focused on counting the ceiling tiles. He pricked both of my eyes, and when it was over, he told me to blink 5 times and open them again. "It's not permanent," he said, though his voice sounded strange. "It wasn't just my vision, it was messing with voices too. It should wear off by the time you get home." He helped me stand. "If you're still experiencing blurred vision after 6 p.m., don't hesitate to contact us." Blurred vision. At first, I didn't understand what he was talking about, until my gaze found his face, which was shrouded in an eerie white fog. I couldn't blink it away. It wasn't that I couldn't see. It was as if my ability to recognize faces had been severed, like someone had driven a pipe through my brain. After temporarily blinding me, they released me from the room. I was maybe 4 steps from the threshold when I nearly tripped over someone. No, it was more like I almost fell over them. I couldn't see faces, but I saw what looked like the shadow of a guy sitting on the floor, arms wrapped around his knees. He was wearing a hospital gown that hung off his thin frame, and his bare legs were bruised, as if he'd had too many shots. Strange, I hadn't been asked to change clothes. This kid was trembling, rocking back and forth, heavy breaths rattling his chest. I guess the tests were different for guys, probably more intense than just some mental health questions and shots in both eyes. Blinking rapidly, I tried to see through the fog, but he had no identity, just a confusing blur on the edges of my vision. He looked human, but the harder I tried to focus, the more uncanny he seemed, like a silhouette bleeding into a shadow that was almost human, and yet there was something wrong. From his sudden, sharp breath, I knew he saw the same thing. I was the ghost hovering in front of him. Not wanting to break the rules, I sidestepped him, nearly tripping over my own feet. The drugs in my eyes, or whatever the fuck they were fucking with me. Did they really have to blind us to prevent us from communicating? Surely that had to be illegal. "Tessa." The voice was drowned of emotion, of humanity, masking any real emotion. But I could still hear his agony, his desperation, and his joy. When bony fingers wrapped around my arm, nails digging into my skin, I froze, not just from the touch, but from his agonizing wail that followed. He was crying. But it didn't sound human, like a robot was mimicking the tears of a human being. "It is you," he whispered, his voice splintering in my mind. How did this stranger know my real name? Something ice-cold crept down my spine. Could he see me? I stepped back, his fingers slipped from my arm one by one. He swayed, and so did his foggy, incoherent face. His torso was easier to make out. The boy was skinny, almost unhealthily so, his clothes hanging off him. "Don't move," he whispered. "They're watching us." I was aware I was backing away, before he was suddenly in my face, his breath cold against my skin. Too cold. "You need to listen to me, because I'm only going to say this once." I noticed what was sticking from his wrist, a broken tube still stuck into his skin. He'd torn out his IV. What did this kid need an IV for? "Shh," he whispered. I didn't say anything, I replied. He laughed, which was a strange choking sound through a robotic filter. "You sound like a Dalek," he giggled, barely holding himself together. Then, without warning, he grasped my arm tighter, drawing a small screech from my throat. "They keep calling me... what's the word again?" His laughter turned hysterical, nearly toppling him over. It was drowned out by more screeches, probably from the drugs masking his real laugh. He leaned closer, forcing me against the wall, breath hissing in quick bursts. "You know?" He laughed. His blurry form swayed to the left, then the right, sweat-soaked curls sticking to his forehead. "Grr," he growled, breaking into another giggle. "That's what they keep calling me." The boy who knew my real name didn't stop to talk. Instead, he flicked my nose before catapulting into a run in the opposite direction. The doors flew open, and a group of guards charged after him. After that weird encounter, I somehow found my way back to my mother, who was also a blurry face. She hugged me and asked how it went. I told her I didn't want to continue, and of course she was like, "Well, you haven't even given it a real try, Tessa. It might surprise you." I was too disoriented to tell her I was partially blind. Thankfully, the blur wore off after an hour, as soon as we left the testing center. Mum was reluctant to pull me from the program until I told her they stabbed me in the eye and temporarily blinded me. I had to beg her to not go back and murder that doctor. Mum was ready to be insufferable again, but this time I actually wanted her to act like a mama bear. But once a contract is signed, not even a parent can break it. So it was either I participated in the experiment, or my mother would be sued. That's how I found myself standing in front of a towering mansion under a dark sky. The place was beautiful, but had a macabre Addams Family vibe. I'm not sure how to describe it because my clumsy words won't do it justice. It was a mix of modern and ancient, crumbling brick walls paired with sliding glass doors. A towering statue of Athena loomed over the fountain in front of me. I snapped a quick photo with my phone, captioning it "Prison for my 100 Instagram followers," before another female guard promptly confiscated it. All of the guards were female, I noticed, no men. I was only allowed one suitcase for clothes and essentials, so I dragged along a single carry-on. The organizers were a brother-sister duo of young scientists named Elizabeth and Nathaniel. They looked and acted like twins, finishing each other's sentences and mimicking expressions, which was unsettling. Elizabeth was the outspoken one, and she refused to call me by my real name outside the experiment. She was stern-looking, with dark hair tied into a ponytail so tight it probably gave her headaches. Nathaniel was quieter, not really a talker. His smile never quite reached his eyes. He looked disheveled, to say the least. His white shirt was wrinkled, thick brown curls hanging in half-lidded eyes. Nathaniel reminded me of a college kid, not a scientist. I greeted them with a forced grin, well aware that I was practically being coerced into this experiment to keep my mother out of legal trouble. Elizabeth kept asking, "Are you excited?" So I played along with, "Yes, I'm so excited to be stuck in a mansion with strangers for 3 months." When the others arrived, we were separated into 2 groups, boys and girls. I wasn't a fan of immediately being divided. I recognized a couple of the kids from the testing center, which were the redhead and ponytail brunette. The redhead was the first to arrive after me, and he looked completely different from the scrawny kid I remembered. Without that obstructing light, he had freckles and wide brown eyes that flickered to me once before avoiding me. He was definitely on his school's football team, broad-shouldered and boyishly handsome, but his eyes kept drifting to my chest. He didn't even greet me, instead shuffling over to the boys' line. I tried to start a conversation mentioning the testing center, but he just snorted and turned away, fully turning his back to me. When the girls arrived, I was comforted. Abigail, the anxious blonde, who was definitely the girl from the testing center, greeted me with a hesitant hug, instantly making her my favorite person. Esme, the ponytail brunette, was quick to pull Abigail away from the boys' prying eyes. Esme was tiny but had a big personality. The moment she stepped out of her Uber, she grinned at me and introduced herself as the future president of the United States. The last 2 girls were Rhea and Jane. Rhea was the influencer type, acting as if we should all recognize her on sight. Jane was exactly what her name suggested. Plain Jane. She wore a white collared shirt, a simple skirt, and a matching headband. I didn't fully get to know the guys that first day, but I did catch their names. Freddie was the guy who would not stop talking about his dog. The only way I can describe him is to imagine Tom Holland's Spider-Man, only with a Long Island accent. He greeted me with a grin before somehow tripping over his own feet. Then there was Adam, a quiet, laid-back guy who definitely smuggled weed in his pack. His trench coat practically screamed pretentious film student. He wouldn't shut up about wanting to show us his collection of Serbian films. June, a Southeast Asian kid, was the joker of the group. His magic tricks were surprisingly good, leaving us all speechless. Finally, there was Ben, who stood apart from the group, his eyes narrowed. I figured I was being paranoid, but he was definitely assessing each of us. He watched Freddie jump around like a child, and June not so subtly flirting with Abigail. This guy was definitely a sociopath, I thought. He was calculating each of us. When his penetrating gaze found mine, I averted my eyes. Then there was Mr. Ignorant, Kai. He wasn't as bad as I initially thought, though. When we headed inside, he apologized. "Sorry about earlier," he said, fidgeting with his hands. "I don't know why I did that." After that little exchange, Kai became an unlikely friend. The rules were simple. Live in the house without adults for 3 months. The organizers explained that we would be monitored the entire time, and whichever group stayed inside the house the longest would win the $1 million prize. We were allowed 1 hour of outdoor time per day, with mental and physical health specialists on standby. Just like I thought, Ben, now knowing our personalities, took charge, gathering everyone in the foyer to assign sleeping arrangements. Girls upstairs, boys downstairs. The first month was surprisingly fun. All 10 of us got along, setting up house rules and a rota for cooking. With Freddie, an unlikely chef, we ate like royalty. There were friendships that blossomed, and not much flirting, which I expected. It felt more like a summer camp than a social experiment. The mansion was huge, with 10 bedrooms, 4 bathrooms, and even an indoor pool where I spent most of my time. I had my own little circle. Abigail, Kai, and me. Abigail confessed that she was an orphan, and Kai admitted he struggled with body image issues and the pressure to be perfect for his parents. Those days with the 3 of us lounging by the pool were nice. Freddie joined us sometimes, diving into the pool and immediately ruining the conversation. Our little personal heaven started to spiral when we ran out of luxury items. I vaguely remembered being told when we ran out. It was everyone's fault. Ben kept sneaking snacks up to his room, and Freddie was stealing for him because that fucking sociopath already had the poor kid wrapped around his little finger. June baked cakes that no one ate except him, with way too much frosting. Even Abigail and I held picnics by the pool with expensive cheese and chocolate, so we weren't innocent either. However, Freddie got the most blame, since he admittedly was a little too obsessed with making every night a celebration. Ben started yelling at him, but it was Ben who insisted on making a luxury 10-cheese pasta a week earlier. When the essentials became our only food, we tried to ration them. June helped Freddie portion meals, and Abigail and I started noting down every food item. I concluded that as long as stuck to our rations, we could live comfortably for the duration of the experiment. Then the boys threw a midnight party. They blew through nearly a week's worth of food in one night. I dragged a disheveled Kai out of Ben's room, which stunk of urine, and demanded to know why they'd done it. He just laughed, spit in my face, and shouted, "Who wants to mattress surf?" That was the start of the divide. Esme called a house meeting and proposed a truce with Ben, the boys' leader. We agreed to split the food equally, and Esme even drew a yellow line on the staircase, making the divide official. Boys were downstairs, and girls were upstairs. I tried to talk to Kai, standing on opposite sides of the yellow line, but he just stared at me with a dead-eyed grin. He wasn't listening to me, bursting out into childish giggles when I tried to talk to him. It was like talking to a fucking toddler. When I shoved him, he snapped, "Uptight bitch." Kai's behavior became increasingly more erratic. He emptied the inside pool. How? I have no fucking idea, so I couldn't go for a swim. Then he declared it the boys' pool, and no girls were allowed. Freddie, who had turned into this cowardly freak, became the boys' messenger. He passed me a message from Kai, asking me to meet him in the foyer at 3 a.m. I actually believed it, until Esme calmly dragged me away, telling me there were 5 boys covered in war paint and armed with eggs. By the second month, everything fell apart. The boys ran out of food and started stealing ours. They became more akin to animals, aggressive and unpredictable, destroying everything in their path. They stopped showering and washing their clothes, moving in a pack formation. Freddie, who once seemed sweet, grew violent when Abigail refused to hang out with him. He screamed in her face before throwing food at her, food that we needed. Adam and Ben ruled the boys' side of the house like kings, sending Freddie running around like a pathetic fucking messenger pigeon. He was so obsessed with being accepted by the boys, this kid had become their lapdog. When I tried to pull him to our side, he started shrieking like an animal, and to my confusion, June came and dragged him away, hissing at us in warning. Esme was too kind for her own good. She offered to give them a small selection of essential food items in exchange for them stopping destroying the house. They agreed, and we gave them 6 loaves of bread, a single pack of cookies, and an 8-pack of water. They used the water to soak us in our sleep, despite having access to tap water. I wasn't expecting Kai to pay me a visit the night after their hazing ritual. He pulled me from my bed, muffling my cries, and dragged me into the downstairs bathroom. I was ready to scream bloody murder, but then I saw the slow, trickling streak of red pooling down his temple. Kai held a finger to his lips, motioning for me to stay silent. He got close, far too close for comfort, backing me into the wall. His lips grazed my ear before he let out a spluttered sob. "There's something wrong with me," Kai whispered. "I keep blacking out, and what I do doesn't make sense. I keep trying to apologize to you, and I don't understand what's gotten into us. But I—" He stepped back, dragging his nails down his face, stabbing them into his temple. "I can feel it," he said, his voice fracturing as he pressed harder against his temple, his lips curling into a maniacal grin. "There's something in my head, and it's right fucking there. I can't get it out of my head." Kai slammed his head into the mirror, but his expression stayed stoic. He didn't even blink. "I can't think," he whispered, tearing at his hair. "I can't fucking think straight, and I can't—" I watched his eyes seem to dilate, the edges of his lips crying out for help, slowly curl into a smirk, his arms falling by his sides. When he shoved me against the wall, the breath was ripped from my lungs. He kissed me, but it was forceful, and it hurt, the weight of his body pinning me in place. Kai's eyes were wide, his gaze locked onto my body, drool spilling from his lips and trailing down his chin. I shoved him back with a shriek, and he stumbled, blinking rapidly. I don't know why I did that. The boy broke down, trying to stifle his own hysterical sobs. With an animalistic snarl, he punched the mirror, and it shattered on impact. His breaths were heavy, spluttering on sobs. "You need to get it out." Kai grabbed a shard of glass, stabbing it into his temple. "Please." His expression crumpled. "Get it out! If I can get it right here." He stabbed the shard into his ear, blood pooling out. "I'm so close, Amelia," he sobbed, clawing at his face. So close, so close, so close. When he stabbed the shard into his cheek and burst into hysterical giggles, I remembered how to run. I could still hear him, his cries echoing down the hallway. "Get it out! Get it out! Get it out!" That night, after no communication from the outside world, I made sure to lock the 5 of us girls in Abigail's room. I was terrified of Kai, and as the night went on, the boys began to thunder upstairs, Wolf whistling and laughing, pounding at our door. I wasn't sure when and how I'd managed to fall asleep, only to be woken around 4 a.m. by a screeching sound and Elizabeth's voice calmly telling us to keep our eyes shut and leave the premises. And no matter what happened, we could not open our eyes, but I didn't have to see. I could already feel it, something sticky pooling between my bare toes as we left our room. Elizabeth's voice led the 5 of us downstairs, and I'll never forget the sensation of slipping in something wet and squishy that oozed and slicked the back of my bare soles. 24 hours later, we were informed that all 5 boys were dead, presumably killed by an animal that had gotten in. But that wasn't true. For 2 weeks, I stayed in the facility for more tests. Elizabeth and Nathaniel told us to be as honest as possible, but when the other girls started to speak up about that night, they were promptly removed from group therapy. Esme was the first. The girl who I looked up to broke into a hysterical fit, attacking 3 guards. The next time I saw her, she wore a dead-eyed smile. I did try to ask her about that night, only for her expression to go blank, her smile stretching wider and wider, almost inhuman. I didn't even realize she'd lunged at me until Esme was straddling me, her hands around my throat. Something wet hit my cheek. Drool. Esme was drooling. I stayed quiet and pretended to take medication I was prescribed for trauma, spitting them down the drain. I didn't tell the people in white prodding me that I lost myself, lost time, and for a dizzying moment lost complete control. The people in white tell me I awoke at the sound of the alarm, but that wasn't true. I just remember rage that was agonizing, tearing through me like poison. I remember awakening to animal-like screeching. I was curled up inside a sterile white room, my knees to my chest, sitting on a plastic chair. I felt perfectly clean, and yet Kai's blood was dried under my fingernails, slick on my cheeks and dripping from my lashes. He was all over me, staining me, painting my clothes to my flesh. His entrails were bunched in my fists, entwined between my scarlet fingers. Rage. What he had done to me played like a stuck record in my head. I was half aware of my fingers scratching at the plastic of the chair. I could hear the other girls screeching, ripping the boys apart, and the stink of flesh, the sweet aroma of blood thick in the air, made my mouth water. I was on the edge of my seat, spitting out fleshy pieces of Kai's brain stuck between my teeth. I think I'm going crazy. His voice startled me, and I lifted my head, finding myself staring into 3 monitors playing footage from inside the mansion. There he was on the screen, balancing on a chair in front of a camera. His voice was slurred, his eyes dilated. I think there's... Kai punched himself in the face until his nose exploded, until he was picking at tiny metal splinters stuck to his lips and chin. "There's something in my head," he wailed. The footage switched this time to the testing center. There I stood, paralyzed, blinking rapidly at the ghostly figure I couldn't see. And standing in front of me was a boy. Tessa. His smile was wide, dreamlike. He could see me. "It is you." I felt something come apart in my head, unraveling, especially when I was painted head to toe in him. But the thought was burned away before it could fully form. The footage flickered to a smiling Elizabeth with her arms folded. "It's okay, Amelia," she said. "We all knew the girls were going to come out on top. From the moment we are born, women are made to be the hunters, while men, who of course mentally devolve with animal-like traits, are the hunted." She laughed, only for Nathaniel to grumble something behind her. Proving this to my stubborn brother was of course a chore, but now he knows. Elizabeth's eyes were manic. "The future is female. Women will climb towards the top of the food chain, while men, our pathetic little boys, will regress to mindless beasts." I took in every word, squeezing entrails between my fists. "All right, Amelia. I want you to repeat what I say, all right? Then you can go finish your meal. I bet you're excited." She leaned forward. "I'm sure you're looking forward to stage 2 of the experiment. Now, what happens when the hunted fight back?" The woman clapped her hands together. "Even better. Why don't we see what happens when the hunters are let out of their cage?" "Just get on with it," Nathaniel said from behind her. "Stop fucking gloating, sis." I found myself mimicking Elizabeth's smile, my lips spreading wider. "It was a bear that killed the boys," she said in a sing-song voice. I copied her, the words rolling off my tongue perfectly. It was a bear. When the sliding glass door opened, releasing me back into the house, Freddie stumbled past me. Like clockwork, the girls surrounded him in a pack. Abigail was the first to lunge, leaping onto his back with a feral snarl. Esme followed, and then Jane. I don't remember much past that moment, but I do remember Freddie's blood sticking to my skin, ingrained and entangled inside me. Elizabeth's voice in my head said it was good. Pieces keep coming back to me, drenched in red. I see each of the boys that were torn apart. I see their terrified faces, and I ask myself why my brain won't let me mourn them. Instead, when I think of what was left of Ben's head caught between Esme's teeth, I only think of an unfiltered, writhing pleasure that creeps up my spine and twists in my gut, bleeding inside my brain. Why did my brain like it? The day I was released from the testing facility, I forgot my bag. Mum told me to go back and get it, and I did, though not before peeking into the room on my left, where I had been staying. Unlike my room, which had a bed and wardrobe, this one held a glass cage. Inside, a boy curled up like a cat, dressed in clinical white shorts and t-shirt. Something was stuck under his arm, just below his shirt sleeve. It looked like a needle, no doubt pumping him full of something. I took a single step over the threshold, a mistake. The instant I moved, he sensed me, diving to his feet and slamming himself head first into the glass. It took me a moment to fully drink this boy in. His eyes were inhuman, milky white filling his iris. There was no sparkle of awareness, all human features replaced with something feral, like I was looking at a rabid dog. When I found myself moving closer, something pulling me towards him, his lips curled back in a vicious snarl, sharp, elongated fangs ready to rip me apart. Strangely, I wasn't scared. Instead, my body took over. In 3 strides, I stood with my face pressed against the glass. Something was familiar about him, but I couldn't put my finger on what it was. Like a version of me that was suppressed and pushed down, did remember him. The boy jumped back with a hiss, then leaned forward hesitantly to sniff the pain. Something inside me snapped, and I hissed back at him. His stink overwhelmed me suddenly, thick and raw. Threat. The feeling was foreign, and yet I couldn't say I hadn't felt it before. Before I could stop myself, my body was lunging into the glass, an animalistic screech tearing from my lips. I couldn't control it. Suddenly, hunger and thirst overwhelmed me. My gaze locked onto his throat, where I sensed a healthy pulse. The boy cocked his head slowly, studying me. He opened his mouth to speak, but his words were tangled and wrong, blended together. That snapped me out of it. He snapped his teeth one more time, as if warning me, before stepping back and resuming his position curled into a ball. When logic returned in violent splutters, whatever had taken over me faded. "Hey!" I tapped on the glass and his head jerked, like an animal's ears twitching. He only offered me an annoyed snort, burying his head in his arms. I took notice of a name scrawled on the cage in permanent marker. Bear. I couldn't get him out of my mind. Kai said there was something inside his head. His erratic behavior, which led to him becoming more animal-like. Was the caged boy the final stage? I wish I could tell you things got better when I got home. But on my first night back, I ate an entire pack of raw bacon. Then I attacked my father, nearly clawing his eyes out. I almost killed my brother. So now I've locked myself in my room, for their safety and my own. 3 days ago, I was formally invited to participate in Stage 2. It will take place from October to December. The bastards covered the first stage up. According to my town, the boys don't even exist anymore. I suspect their families have been paid off, or something more nefarious. Whoever, or whatever, was in that cage at the testing facility is Stage 2. Mum said no. Fucking, obviously. Unlike Dad, she believes something is wrong with me. After examining me herself, she refuses to involve outsiders, Mum found a tiny incision behind my ear. She told me to leave it alone and promised to get me real help before whatever it is activated, but she's as scared as I am. She won't go to work. She just sits in front of my bedroom door, waiting. I've tried to copy Kai. Whatever they put inside his head, they put inside mine too. But no matter how many times I force the blade of Dad's penknife into the back of my ear, I can't find anything. Still, I know something is there. It's why I can smell Mum's scent so clearly. And no matter how hard I try to push the thought away, all I can think about is tearing out her throat. I know the other girls are waiting. I can already sense them crowding around the house, waiting for their kill. Mum is right behind the door with a baseball bat. We've been talking. I told her to kill me the second I stopped responding to her voice. She's not going to let anything or anyone hurt me. But I'm terrified she's going to have to use her weapon on me. Or one of my girls. Because I don't think I'm her daughter anymore. I don't think I'm fucking human anymore. I feel absolutely sick writing this, but I've been told by a friend that writing this stuff down might be important. That same friend also told me that it wouldn't be a good idea to share my name, so I won't. I'm writing this from a Hilton Garden Inn about 5 minutes from my apartment. I haven't been there in 2 months, but my neighbor texted me an update about it today. It sounds bad. They have torn up all of the carpet, large sections of drywall are missing, and they've started ripping out the ceiling. When I say they, I'm not sure if it's still the police, or if the leasing agency has hired someone to clean up. I have pictures, letters, furniture, and memories in that apartment. It was home for almost 5 years, and I just don't care. I'll never, ever set foot in that place again. 2 months ago, we had a massive storm roll through Cincinnati. I live, or lived, in an apartment complex closer to the edge of the city. I don't want to give too many specifics, but imagine one of those cookie-cutter standalone complexes that has a few apartment buildings and a shitty pool. The rent wasn't the cheapest I could find, but the complex is gated, so I justified the cost with an increase in safety. I'm a single woman, and have always been a little paranoid about living alone. Once I finished college and took a graphic design job here in the city, I realized that I no longer had a pool of college friends to choose a roommate from. I was faced with 2 options, either live by myself for the first time, or play random roommate roulette. Unimpressed by either, I decided to create a third option, my Murphy. Murphy is, or was, the greatest thing that ever happened to me. I know a lot of dog owners say that about their pets, but Murphy really was my saving grace. Moving to the city was hard for me, and starting my first real job was even harder. Being greeted by Murphy's big goofy smile was the highlight of coming home every day. When I adopted Murphy, he was about the size of a soccer ball and almost as round. However, it didn't take more than a couple of months before that soccer ball began growing into a mountain. Pun intended. My Murphy was a Bernese mountain dog, and at just under 120 pounds he was more mountain than dog. He was a gentle giant, and probably not the stalwart guardian I'd adopted him to be, but he was my very best friend. We'd sit on the couch together every night, and he'd lay his heavy head in my lap. We'd go for walks in the common areas, and the handful of older people who stroll around our complex would always give him a treat. Every night we'd lay in bed next to one another. This nightmare began with the storm. Our complex is kind of in the middle of corporate chain hell, surrounded by gas stations, a Red Lobster, an Outback steakhouse, you get the gist. However, despite our proximity to the center of this commercial purgatory, we always lose power during these nasty storms. What's worse, we must be near the end of some network or grid, because we're always the last group of buildings in our area to have power restored. This storm was particularly bad. I remember getting home sometime after dark and it was pouring down rain. The leaves hadn't begun to change just yet, but there were twigs and leaves all over the parking lot from the wind. Luck would have it that I slipped into my apartment just before the complex's streetlights went out. I was greeted by a dark apartment. I don't think people realize how poorly apartment complexes like this are designed in terms of natural light. My whole apartment only has 2 windows, one at the front in the kitchen and one in my little bedroom. That leaves the main hallway, both bathrooms, and the living room without light for most of the day. During an outage like this, and especially after the sun goes down, you open that door to a pitch-black apartment. The primal fear one has when they're met with such darkness evaporated the minute I heard Murphy's collar jingle in from somewhere in the dark. He came bounding out and I felt him barrel into my leg and up onto me. I scratched his heavy head and he plopped down, trotting back into the darkened living room. I did what every sane person does when returning to a dark apartment on a stormy night. I walked through every room with my phone's light to make sure there weren't any unwelcome visitors lurking in the shadows. That split second before you throw back a shower curtain, when your mind has prepared itself for the small chance that there's actually something there, can leave you on edge. Anyways, after making my rounds, it was time to brave the dreaded rain to let Murphy use the bathroom. I had been diligent in training him, and we'd actually gotten to the point where I could just stand at the top of the stairs while he'd run down to the bushes next to our building. With a quick clap, he'd bound right back up the steps and into the apartment. As I opened our front door, it really struck me just how dark it was outside. Not one of the nauseatingly bright restaurant signs was glowing, and the handful of headlights I could see through the rain were far off in the distance. The project I'm toiling on at work is for an overseas client, so I've had to keep some weird hours to keep my meetings with them. I hadn't checked my phone when I got home, but I'm sure it was at least 11 p.m. Murphy must have darted past my leg without me even knowing, not an uncommon occurrence, and was doing his business somewhere in the dark. I couldn't see much in the murky night, but I did catch a glance at one thing as the beam of a distant car danced across the sheets of rain. Across the parking lot, I saw a man turn 90 degrees to my building, and he was relieving himself. He was only illuminated for a second, but I swear I saw it. It isn't unusual to see drunk people stumbling around the complex at night, and I've seen a lot worse in this parking lot than a drunk dude pissing. Even still, there was something so creepy about it. The rain, the darkness, it was like he was hiding out there. Murphy took longer to come back than usual, but he eventually crawled up the steps out of the rain. I could hear him panting as he reached the top step, and he began a half-hearted shake to get the water off of his fur. We both moseyed back into the apartment. I felt my way back inside and plopped down on the couch. I used my phone's screen to light my path. As the little flashlight on my phone stopped working after I dropped it a few months earlier, I pulled up a blanket and started scrolling on my phone. I kept the brightness low to conserve battery. I heard Murphy thumping his way down the hall towards me, and I realized that his cadence wasn't quite right. Maybe 6 months previously, Murphy had injured one of his front paws on a piece of glass in the parking lot, and developed an odd walk for the better part of 2 weeks. His cadence now was similar to that, irregular and slightly off-kilter. Even still, I felt his weight impact the couch cushions as he jumped up to join me. As I scrolled, Murphy's head nuzzled under my arm. His head felt big, and I winced at the water still clinging to his fur. Something else struck me too. Murphy stank. Don't get me wrong, a wet dog smelling bad isn't exactly unheard of, but I mean he smelled bad. It wasn't dog bad either. The only thing I could liken it to was a smell I'd encountered while I was working at Dollar General in high school. There was this guy who worked there, probably 18 or 19, who just smelled terrible all the time. Just the worst body odor you could imagine. The guy obviously didn't bathe a lot, as evidenced by his perpetually greasy hair. Murphy smelled something like that. As he nuzzled his snout into my chest, I briskly patted his head and told him to go on and get off the couch. He snapped up and lumbered elsewhere. Scrolling on my phone got kind of old, and the rhythmic pattering of the rain outside was tempting my eyelids closed. Once again, feeling my way through the dark, I made my way into the bedroom. Feeling bad about the scolding I had given Murphy, I called for him to join me in bed. I know some people think it's gross to let their dog sleep with them, but Murphy has always been a great pup to sleep next to. Sometimes he sleeps at the end of the bed, and other times he snuggles right up next to me. I hoped that Murphy didn't smell quite as bad now that he had had some time to dry off. As I heard him in the hallway, the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I heard footsteps in the hallway, not the friendly trotting of my Murphy, but the distinct, menacing footfalls of a human being. My ears rang in the silence, just as Murphy came bounding into the room unbothered. I sighed in relief. Hearing the neighbor's footsteps isn't that uncommon, but they seldom sound that loud. I guessed that the power outage had killed all of the background noise I was used to, as there was no air conditioner or refrigerator running to muffle the sounds of apartment living. The darkness is one thing, but the silence is another. I'm glad I still had the sound of rain to serve as my white noise. Murphy jumped into bed with one big leap. He wasn't wet anymore, but he still stank to high heaven. As he pawed at my side, I decided to pet him a little before banishing him to the end of the bed. I rubbed his big head and realized just how big he'd gotten. Looking at him grow little by little every week, it was easy to forget how large he was. I rubbed his head in the dark, marveling at how big my little pup had gotten. It seemed like Murphy was getting bigger by the hour. While I was rubbing his fur, I felt Murphy jump up and begin uncharacteristically licking my face. He'd licked and nibbled on me as a puppy, but I'd broken him of that habit a long time ago. He got in 4 or 5 licks to my face before I scolded him and pushed him off. He went silent and still. Then, without warning, he did it again, jumping up on me with his weight and licking my face. This time I yelled at him and felt his weight shift to the end of the bed. At this point, I was convinced that Murphy had gotten into something outside. Maybe he'd messed with a dead animal or gotten into some garbage. Either way, he was acting odd and continued to stink up the room. I resolved to check him out in the morning and call the vet if he still wasn't acting right. I laid back down, and with Murphy perched by my feet, I checked the time on my phone. 1:15. Right as I checked it, the screen froze, and the 3% battery marker in right-hand corner invited a black screen. With my phone finally dead, the decision was made for me, and I closed my eyes to go to sleep. I woke up disoriented in the dark. It had to be some time later in the night, as my room remained dark as pitch. I woke to that foul smell and a warm sensation over my shoulder. As my wits returned, I realized that Murphy had migrated up the bed to sleep next to me. However, unlike his usual posture of curling into a massive ball, it felt like Murphy had one of his paws resting on my shoulder. I could hear him breathing, almost snoring, in a way dissimilar to my memory. Once again, I felt the hair on my neck stand up, as if I sensed something imminently wrong. That feeling faded, though, as I reached out to grab my Murphy's fur. He felt soft and warm, and I felt him heave with every breath. I went to move his paw off my shoulder when I realized how swollen it felt. Usually I could wrap my hand all the way around Murphy's leg, but his leg felt thick and swollen in my hand. It also felt heavy as I pushed it off of me. Murphy stirred and stopped his snoring, but didn't move or stir. I turned around to avoid his smell and drifted back to sleep. I woke up to the earliest signs of light outside. It couldn't be any later than 7 o'clock or so. All I could see of my room was the vague outline of my doorway and window. Feeling the urge to pee, I rolled out of bed, only to jolt at the sound of a thud in the hallway. I froze, momentarily wondering where Murphy was. We weren't in the room, which almost certainly meant that it was him thumping around in the hallway. I made my way to the doorway, freezing once more. The door was closed. Had I closed it when I went to bed? I usually closed it, but I couldn't remember. Either way, the door was closed and Murphy wasn't with me. I twisted the knob and gently swung the door inward. Peering around the corner, I stared down the darkened hall. All at once my heart stopped itself and retreated to the furthest reaches of my stomach. There at the end of my hallway stood a figure. It must have been at least 6 feet tall, bulky and unnatural in the bluish hue of the rainy morning. Its unnatural frame held something in its hand, but I couldn't make out what it was. What I could make out was the head, which betrayed the unquestionable silhouette of a Bernese mountain dog. It was my Murphy, but it wasn't my Murphy, not at all. In an unnaturally swift motion, it fell from its human stance and crashed to the floor on all fours, shaking the apartment as it did. It let out an unconvincing bark, loud and guttural, staring at me through the dark. Before I could register it, the thing was bounding down the hall at me, sloppily crawling towards me on all fours. I don't remember screaming, but the hoarseness in my voice and my neighbor's calls to police suggest I must have. I remember retreating to the bedroom. I remember locking the door. I remember the banging and howling from the other side as the blows to my door hit around the height of a human fist. The howls weren't my Murphy, or any dog for that matter. They sounded like the growls and screams that echo through a mental institution. There are gaps in my memory. Locking the door is so vivid in my mind, and so is the howling and screaming of that monster. What I don't remember is opening the bedroom window or jumping into the hedges below. The rain-soaked ground must have made for a soft landing, because I didn't break anything despite falling from a story up. What I haven't forgotten, and what I'll never forget, is the look he gave me from that window. The pale blue of the early morning, coupled with the cold indifference of the still pounding rain, framed that horror in my bedroom window. I looked up from my place on that muddy ground to see him glaring down from my bedroom. Tattered fur across his torso gave way to a decidedly human, albeit grotesque human head. Stringy hair framed a pale, sickly face grinning with a nauseating row of yellowed teeth. It was the face of a man no older than 30, though twisted and aged by unspeakable depravity. He winked a soulless eye at me and closed the window. I learned later that what he'd been holding in his hand was a large paintbrush, the kind you use to paint a wall. The innocent thuds I heard that morning were the sound of that freak painting my name on the walls of my apartment with the blood of my Murphy. His name was Winton Norris. I'd never seen the man in my life, at least if I had, I'd never realized it. I knew the neighbors to the right of me, but I'd always figured that the apartment on the other side of me was empty. Sometimes it was. Sometimes it wasn't. The same goes for my downstairs neighbors too. I always thought the unit was owned by somebody who didn't have the good sense to rent it out. For at least 2 years, I never saw anyone come or go from those apartments. In hindsight, there were always clues that something was amiss. Little cracks in the seams of wall paneling, small holes drilled in the living room wall, floor vents that never seemed to have any airflow. I always chalked it up to the shoddy maintenance work you often find in these apartments. The detective told me there were at least 9 peepholes looking into my apartment, spread out between the downstairs unit and the one next door. Winton Norris owned them both. Winton wasn't on anybody's radar. From what the police say, he'd lived a quiet life as a programmer for the better part of his career, living in a filthy little apartment somewhere across the complex. The detective suspects he saw me walking Murphy one day, and what might have started as some creepy crush snowballed into a sick infatuation. At some point, they think he got jealous of my sweet Murphy, as strange as that sounds. The prosecutor shared Winton's bank records with me a couple of weeks ago. He spent almost every penny he had on those 2 units, setting them up for this grand plan. His biggest investment, however, came in the form of that vile creation, the suit. There's a man in Japan that the detective told me about. I don't remember his name, but I do remember the photo he showed me. It was in an article from Business Insider that read, "Japanese man spends $15,000 on lifelike dog costume." I encourage you to look it up, just to give you an idea of what this thing looks like. Winton had every post from this guy saved on his computer, and an endless number of computer sketches of his own dog costume. He must have spent hours upon hours, months upon months, watching Murphy and I in our home. He had to practice walking, panting and laying down, just feet from where we lay every night. This creep was mirroring us and longing for the night he'd replace my dog out in the rain. I don't know if he waited for the perfect night when the power was out, or if it just worked out that way. Either way, it was clear he was going to be caught. Even after closing my bedroom window, he didn't have the sanity to flee, or even kill himself. When the police arrived, they found him in the middle of the living room on all fours, completely naked and panting like a dog. He was extremely thin. I was told he likely lost weight in the months leading up to that night in an attempt to weigh the same as my Murphy, but he never quite lost enough. That night never ends. The sense of dread I have lying awake in this hotel room is immeasurable. The determination he had to invade my life, to take my Murphy, and to spend an evening in my puppy's place. The nightmare won't end until he's gone. There's a hearing tomorrow down at the courthouse, and the detective tells me that the monster will be there. I bought a pistol from the pawn shop this morning and have been practicing with it in the mirror all afternoon. I'm going to get a good night's sleep again, no matter what it takes. I've never liked Halloween. Trick-or-treaters, tacky costumes, plastic skeletons. It grated on me. I'd never liked the holiday. But living in Australia, it was never really a big deal, so I could easily ignore it. But I despised how it had started seeping into Australia from the States. Another capitalist bloated holiday that had strayed so far from its origin. Last year, despite having not one horrid decoration littering my property, my door was banged on relentlessly throughout the night by hordes of trick-or-treaters and their obnoxious parents. Some of the older children weren't happy when I told them to fuck off through the door and proceeded to tip my bins and kick down my letterbox. Kids will be kids, was all the operator said when I called the police. Useless. So this year, I booked a trip out of the city and as far from civilization as I could. A train ride through Australia's remote outback for 4 days and nights. I was a little irritated that the ticket booth at the station had some cheesy fake cobwebs and spiders in the windows, but thankful once I boarded to see no sign of Halloween. This train ride across the outback was my escape, a few days of quiet, where I'd seen nothing but wilderness, desert, and the occasional old ghost town. It didn't take long to leave civilization behind, and as I ventured further inland, the landscape slowly changed from green bushland to dry grass, before even the driest of grasses could not survive. Outside, endless stretches of red earth now blurred by, sparse trees and bushes dotting the landscape. I let the steady, rhythmic hum of the train lull me into a trance, watching as the scenery stretched on, uninterrupted. I enjoyed dinner with my own company, reading a book while occasionally stealing glances outside the window. The horizon glowed like molten metal as the Australian sun lowered itself across the desert's dry, sandy surface. Day 2, we stopped briefly in a small town, population 12, before boarding again and heading further towards the centre of Australia. I had browsed the wares there and picked up a couple of books from the local pub/post office/restaurant/convenience store. I sat down in a comfy seat, popped in my headphones to listen to some classical music, and began skimming the books I had picked up. Normally, I would stick to autobiographies, classic tales or true stories. The selection in the town wasn't the greatest, but one book there was about true Australian unsolved mysteries. It was a collection of stories, a lot of which were focused on the Australian outback. Most were suspected kidnappings, murders, that sort of thing. A couple were around alien sightings and abductions, something I had heard of in Australia but was not really interested in, and one discussed ley lines. Now, I'd never heard of a ley line before, so this piqued my interest a little. I dove into this story and found out that ley lines are theoretical alignments that some believe connect various ancient, sacred, or significant sites across a landscape. Some even believe that these ley lines may have spiritual, healing, or even supernatural properties, and apparently Australia had them crisscrossing all over the outback, with a couple of particular ones that were considered extremely powerful. It went on to explain a range of supposed incidents on or near these ley lines, creatures, UFOs, voices in the desert, even a story of a small mining town, Langara, that was at the intersection of a ley line that completely disappeared in the early 1900s. Not just the residents, but the entire town. As I finished up the story, the train suddenly went dark as we entered a tunnel. I placed the book back on the table and leaned back in my chair as the lights in the cabin flickered on. The train raced through the tunnel before emerging out the other side, the bright Australian sun temporarily blinding me. The train rumbled on. The red sand desert was broken occasionally by old buildings, rusted cars and gnarled trees as I stared out the window, not really paying attention as I daydreamed. My mind was caught up in replaying the events of last Halloween, and how I was so glad to be here, not home, this time round. Today was the 31st, and while it was still early, soon my neighborhood would be overrun by trick-or-treaters, and while I was here, 1,000 kilometers away, the thought of it irritated me and started to get me wound up. I took a deep breath and decided to close my eyes and relax. I turned up the volume of the classical music and tried to clear my mind, letting the rumble of the train and the symphony of the orchestra blend together, rising and falling in a calming rhythm. I'm not sure how long I slept, though I definitely did sleep, as a completely new song was playing when I opened my eyes. It was dark again, and at first I thought maybe I had slept the entire afternoon away before I was suddenly hit again with the bright Australian sun as the train exited another tunnel. I took my headphones out and stood up to stretch. I contemplated going to my room for a bit, but decided I would just stay here. I looked around the carriage at the other guests, most of whom were staring longingly out the windows at the desert, smiles on their faces, before doing one more stretch and sitting down again. I'm not sure how many times we had passed it before I noticed it, but I know we had gone through maybe 2 more tunnels before something clicked. We passed by a large, gnarled tree, this one blackened, possibly from a fire or lightning strike. I had seen a similar one earlier out the window, just before we had passed by a small mining town. It's not that rare to see them, so I don't know why, but I felt a knot start to form in my stomach. Something told me it wasn't just a similar tree, but it was the same tree. I looked ahead, and the knot tightened as I could see a small town looming in the distance. Just a coincidence, I told myself, trying to brush it off. I hadn't paid much attention to the last town we went through, but I could not have been more alert this time. It appeared deserted, though in well-kept condition considering. Some paint appeared peeled here and there, but overall it seemed like a very tidy, quaint little town. There would have been no more than 20 buildings lining a single main road. There was a welcome sign, but I had been staring intently at the buildings, looking for any sign of life, and had missed the name on the sign. An hour passed, and the train continued winding along the rusty tracks, cutting through abandoned buildings and barren stretches of desert. As we approached a tunnel, a strange sense of unease bubbled up. I watched as the train slipped into darkness and took a deep breath, trying to calm myself, counting the seconds until we emerged on the other side. When the light broke, I blinked, feeling a sense of déjà vu. I told myself of course it looked familiar. It's the outback. The whole thing looks familiar. That did little to temper my rising anxiety. It didn't take long to confirm my worst fear. There it was again, the twisted tree, exactly as I remembered, its branches frozen in the same eerie pose. The train pressed on, and I sank deeper into my seat, trying to ignore the unsettled feeling creeping up my spine. We passed by the town again, exactly as I remembered it. In fact, now that I thought about it, I couldn't even think of the sun having moved its position in the sky, as the shadows cast on the ground looked exactly the same. Another hour passed and another tunnel loomed ahead. This time I closed my eyes, hoping the darkness would settle my nerves, but as we came out on the other side, my pulse quickened. There was the twisted tree again, and the same little town, everything eerily unchanged. And then I saw it. A figure far off in the distance, silhouetted against the barren landscape. My eyes fixed on it, feeling a chill crawl up my spine. I couldn't make out any details from here, but something about the figure felt wrong, like it was watching me. I stood up. "Excuse me?" I called out to the passenger across the aisle from me, hoping for some reassurance, but he just stared at me with a blank smile, eyes unfocused, face unmoving. I looked around, searching the other faces in the carriage, but they were all the same. Strangers with serene, placid smiles that seemed almost painted on. My skin prickled with cold dread. I tried opening both doors at each end of the carriage, but they were both locked. I made my way back to where I had been sitting and slumped back into my seat. As the train rolled forward, I kept glancing out the window, my pulse quickening as we neared another tunnel. The figure outside had vanished from view, but not from my memory. I sat, staring out into the empty expanse of the outback, wondering if I was losing my mind. But then we passed through another tunnel, and this time when we emerged, something was different. The sun sat in the same spot, but it was darker, somehow. The blue sky had a tinge of red to it, and the outback felt different. We approached the twisted tree and my heart sank. The tree was darker, not in color, but in energy. I don't know how to explain it, but I could feel it. Some branches had been broken, lying on the ground near its gnarled roots. The abandoned town had deteriorated also, paint peeling and some roofs sagging, appearing more decrepit than before. The figure was back too, still far off, but much closer than it had been. The shape of its body somehow wrong, too tall, limbs too long, as though it didn't quite fit together, and it moved in an awkward, limping manner, lumbering towards the train. I swallowed hard, pressing myself back into my seat. My phone. I reached for it, praying for reception. Nothing, just empty bars mocking me. An hour later, we entered another tunnel. Halfway through, still holding my phone in my hands, I saw a single bar of reception flicker to life. My heart pounded. Desperate, I tried to make a call, but just as a voice answered, the reception dropped as we exited the tunnel. That's when I started writing this. If I can make a call for help, then perhaps I can type it out and send it. The landscape was decaying, everything I'd seen before deteriorating at an alarming rate. The tree was little more than a charred husk, and some buildings in the town were now nothing but a pile of rubble. The sky was definitely redder and darker than before, even though the sun had not moved, and the figure was much, much closer. It moved faster now. Its featureless face seemed to be staring at me, long limbs clambering towards me. It radiated evil, a black aura surrounding it like a mist. I knew the next time I saw it, it would be right next to the train, and I don't know what would happen then. I don't know how I can tell, but I know that it's me it wants. Its featureless face can't hide its pure, malicious hatred for me. I tried again to alert the other passengers, to snap them out of their spell, but as I moved down the aisle, the faces of the passengers turned to meet me, one by one. Their eyes still empty, their expressions painted on. They watched me with those blank, serene smiles, the kind you'd give a child having a nightmare. I wanted to scream, to shake them, but fear choked me. So now I wait for the tunnel. My finger will hover above the post button, so as soon as I see a single bar of reception, I will try and post this as a call for help and as a warning. I pray I make it out of this and make it back home, but I fear that this next tunnel will be my last. So goodbye. Don't forget me.